I'd like to introduce my friend Greg Koukl. Greg Koukl is the president and founder of Stand to Reason, which is a Southern California apologetics organization. They've been around for some 20 years now. That's right. And Greg has spoken all over the country. Actually, he's even spoken internationally to thousands of people. It brings a very unique and special way of communicating clearly, thoughtfully, and winsomely. And he will tell you a little bit about their apologetics, their ambassador's creed that they offer in this. And that's what we hope happens tonight, that there is a winsome, intelligent, and thoughtful discussion about these issues that are really brought to the fore every day in our news media. So we want, as Christians, to be well prepared. We want to be articulate, and we want to be thoughtful about these kinds of issues. We want to know that what we're saying is true. We don't want to give out misinformation. And at the same time, we want to be persuasive and attractive in so doing. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Greg Koukl from Stand to Reason.
Thank you, Lenny. Thank you. Now, how many of you remember Chester from Gunsmoke? Right? Dennis Weaver, that's who I feel like right now. That was back in the 60s, but he's a guy who walked with a limp. And 2.5 months ago, I had my little girl down in San Diego. She's 4 years old, and she wanted me to take her swimming in the hotel where we were staying. So I dove in the pool, and right when I came up, she said, "Papa, I got to go potty." And so I walked out of that pool, dripping wet, pounded across the carpet of the lounge, and just as I put my foot on the tile in front of the desk to ask where the potty was with little 4-year-old in tow, I went right down. Ripped out my MCL right there. Now, it didn't blow up, it didn't discolor, it didn't even hurt that much. So for the next 2.5 months, I played tennis and went jogging and did squats and everything, and I couldn't figure out why it never healed. So I went in and had an MRI, and they told me to cut it right in half, and the doctor said, and it's kind of like healing the ends up a little bit, we've got to re-injure it. So he went in there with a needle and started poking around to get it re-injured. You probably didn't need to hear about the needle part, did you? Then he locked me down for 6 weeks in this brace, so that's why I'm thumping around here like a pirate. One of the biggest difficulties that I have to deal with as a follower of Christ who is trying to make a defense for my point of view, for Christianity, is the problem of evil. And one of the issues that comes up with the problem of evil is, what is God doing about it? Now, it's a very complex issue, and this isn't the night to talk about the issue at large, but one of the things that I have to say about it is that, well, actually, God's doing a lot of things, and here is one of the things that he's doing. He has given us institutions, given that there is evil in the world based on man's rebellion, until the time that he resolves everything finally at the end of our story. We're in the middle of our story now. Until that time, he's given us some institutions to contain evil, to mitigate its impact. Institutions like government, institutions like the church, and institutions like the family. And really, you don't have to be a theologian to look around to realize that when the government and the church and the family are not doing the job that God intended for them, evil proliferates in our culture. And whenever any of those institutions are undermined, then there's more evil in our culture. And this is why I think the topic for tonight is so important. And it's not just the topic of homosexuality. It's the topic of same-sex marriage, because this is an issue that's a policy issue that affects our government, our culture, and affects, well, you'll see how deeply rooted this whole issue is in the basic functioning of our culture, I hope, by the end. But it's important because of that. But there's another concern here. Now, I realize I'm at a church, and so there's probably mostly followers of Christ here, and I'm glad you're here, and there are probably some non-followers of Christ, maybe some tire kickers or some people that maybe don't sit up on the same side of this issue that I probably do, or many other Christians, and you're here to hear what I have to say, and I'm glad you're here. I'm not here to convert you tonight. I kind of want to annoy you in a good way. I want to put a stone in your shoe and get you thinking, and I hope that's what happens this evening. But I want to say something to the followers of Christ that are here. I do not think that homosexuality is way up at the top of the theological pecking order for Christians. It's never been discussed in any major council of the church. It's never been a big deal. It's been part of Christian theology, but a smaller part. Many other things are much more important theologically than that particular issue. But I will say this, there are times in our culture when the circumstances of our culture catapult some minor issue into an issue of major importance. And I think this is true here. This is an issue that has been forced upon Christians. It is not something that we've gone out looking for. The fight in their culture regarding this issue has not been one that we have started. Even there's a couple of obnoxious people here and there that end up on the news. By and large, that's not been the status of Christians in this discussion. But what this has become is it's become a line in the sand. And our culture has drawn the line, and they have said to us, followers of Christ, you cross this line. You cross this line and join us. You celebrate diversity and all that it means to us, and we will like you. And if you don't, we will hurt you. Now, I'm using my words advisedly here. It won't be just social rejection. There's more that's happening, especially on this particular issue. And what I have seen is that many followers of Christ are being cowed by this. They're getting pushback and they're stepping back. And some have actually stepped over the line and said, okay, it's no big deal after all. We'll join you and avoid the frustration. But I'm here to encourage you, Christians now, not to do that. I hope I give you some reasons why, in addition to ones you already know about, not to do that. But I want you to see the strategic significance, in my view, of this issue in our culture today. Because the minute you step across that line, there's another issue that the culture is already pushing back on that is of major significance, and that is the Great Commission. That is the last charge that Jesus left the church. It's the main function of the church. Go into all nations and make disciples. You can't make disciples unless you lead people to Christ, and you can't lead people to Christ until you tell them the message, which, by the way, this church is very famous for doing, thankfully, that He is the only solution to the real problem, to the problem of sin. But when you say that, the culture hates that message more than it hates any message about homosexuality. And they are going to say the same thing to us when we compromise on this first one that they said to get us across this line, and that is your view of religious exclusivism as opposed to pluralism, always lead to God. Your belief that Jesus is the only way, that is narrow-minded, that's intolerant, that's dogmatic, that's arrogant, that's bigoted, and that's hateful. And that is an issue that does matter. And my concern is now strategically about this issue. If we are not clear on this issue, if our line is being tested on this issue by the culture and we give in, I think then it's going to be much harder for us to stand firm on the thing that deeply matters. This issue matters, but not like the Great Commission. So I want you to see that there's a lot at stake here. But it's necessary to address. But even so, it's not an easy one because I think this, for me, having dealt with all kinds of issues that pertain to the credibility of Christianity in our culture, this one is the most difficult. For one, it requires some careful thinking. It requires that we pay attention to a line of reasoning, that we understand the impact of ideas. It's not enough just to listen to slogans. Well, we just want what's fair. This is a justification for same-sex marriage that I've heard a lot, and that's a powerful statement. It's going to take a little while for you to see why that particular statement, though persuasive sounding, misses the point entirely. And a lot of people are not willing to just sit and listen and follow a line of argument. And I'm glad you're here tonight, and some of you are taking notes, and I hope you do. Because I am going to pace out something, a point of view, and I'm going to give you reasons and a rationale for my view. And the second thing is, not only is it hard and you've got to follow the reasons, and I'll do the best I can to hold your hand and make this clear to you, but it takes a certain patience and goodwill to listen. If you are here tonight and you're someone that's not inclined to be sympathetic to, let's call it, the classical view on this, my encouragement is that you give me your goodwill tonight. I will try to give you mine. My goal is not to malign or to name call or to bash or offend or to attack or to belittle or to heap any special condemnation on any group whatsoever. My goal is simply to first try to see what the Bible has to say about this, and then also make a case from outside of the Bible, because if the Bible doesn't appeal to you, there's other ways to argue for this regarding the issue of marriage. And I'll lay out the issues in an orderly way for your consideration. And if you don't like what you hear, then fine. You don't have to believe it. I'm just asking for the goodwill to hear me through. This issue matters. And since I mentioned that there's actually two ways to approach this, and as followers of Christ, we are informed by what God says about this through His Word. And so I'm going to start by talking about actually two main passages from the Scripture to kind of, in a certain sense, reset our moral compass on this, because I think because of the pressure from the outside, Christians are confused just on the moral assessment of homosexual behavior. And I want to give you some passages. We'll talk briefly about them. You can take some notes, and you can go home on your own and be Bereans, all right? Go back and check it out for yourself. Read these passages at length and see if the case that I've made regarding them is not a reasonable one, given the text. If you're not a Christian, I hope you care what the Bible says, but you're not directed by it in the same way that followers of Christ are. And so when it comes to same-sex marriage, I'm going to take a different approach. I'm not going to take an internal approach to the Bible. I'm going to take an external approach, and I'm going to build a case regarding marriage. Then I'm going to answer objections to the view I advance. Then I'm also going to answer the question, well, what does it hurt me? If two same-sex couples get married down the street, how am I going to be hurt by that? Well, I have a very specific answer. Actually, I have 4 different ones for you to consider. And then I'll close with what I think is actually going on in this whole debate. And I don't think it's about equal rights. I think it's about something else. But once again, you're free to take and consider the things that I've said. Let's start with the Scripture. I'm just going to focus on an Old Testament passage and a New Testament passage, but they strike me as the ones that are the most clear to give us a perspective about what God thinks about this. So we're going to start in Genesis 19. Genesis 19 is the account, it's not a story, this really happened, of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by 2 angels who came to visit Lot. And the question that I want to ask very briefly is, why did God destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Did it have anything to do with homosexuality? It's the question. Now, I'll give you the story kind of quickly. I want to save time for the rest of the material by not reading it, but you have the text, many of you, in front of you, so you can start following. It's midway through the chapter. Let me see if I can find a starting place for you. I just have Genesis 19 in my notes. So, in Genesis 18, God visits Abraham with 2 men who were, we learn later, are angels. And he promises to Abraham a son. But he also looks down at the valley where Sodom and Gomorrah is, and he makes an enigmatic statement about something he is going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's a little bargaining session that's going on between God and Abraham as to whether God would destroy the city if there were 50 righteous people, or 40, or 30, or 20. So Abram whittles God down to 10 people. He won't destroy the city. Then he sends the angels down into the city, and this is where we pick it up in chapter 19. Because as they come into the square, Lot meets them and invites them into his home. The men, who are actually angels, but they look like men, say, no, we'll stay outside here in the square. And Lot says, no, don't do that. And so they decide to go with him. And when they're with him in his house, the rest of the people in the town, from every quarter, the old and the young, the men of the town, besiege the house and demand for Lot to release the two men so that they might know the men. Now, the word know, in Old Testament speaks, means to have sexual relations with them. Now, some people suggested, oh, no, they didn't mean that. That's not what's going on. They just wanted to interrogate these two men to make sure that they weren't spies. Of course, what Lot does next show that this couldn't be what they had in mind, because what Lot says is, here, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me give them to you, and you do whatever you want with them, but please don't harm these men that are under my roof. Now, I don't think that what Lot had in mind was, my daughters, you want to interview these guys? Wait, my daughters have never been interviewed by anybody. Why don't you interview them? That doesn't make any sense. No, they were trying to force themselves sexually upon these men. So much so, in fact, they got mad at Lot. And they said to Lot, you have come here as an alien. You're an outsider. You're not one of us. And already you're passing judgment on us. Who are you to judge? You ever hear that one? Now we'll treat you worse than we wanted to treat them. So the angels pull him inside the door. They bar the door. They strike the men with blindness. The men with blindness now don't go home. They keep trying to find the door to keep going after the men, even though they're struck blind. The angel said, how many people do you have in your house? I just got these in my household. Come on out. We are going to destroy the city, which they did. They destroyed all of Sodom and Gomorrah in a very dramatic fashion. So the question here, now it strikes me as a casual reader that this seems to be obviously in response to the homosexuality that pervaded the community and expressed itself in the attempted rape of Lot's visitors. So the question here is, what was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, or what was it that God judged Sodom and Gomorrah for? And there's really two different options here. One of them is the obvious one, the classical one, it's homosexuality. This is where the word sodomy came from, by the way. The second one is that we've really misunderstood this passage over the years, because what was going on here was from God's perspective now, a grotesque lack of hospitality. And hospitality really mattered to Middle Eastern people. And this forcing themselves on this men, the principal problem was the inhospitality. And so therefore God judged, Sodom and Gomorrah because of their inhospitality. So were these men inhospitable? Were the people of the community? Well, I guess so. If you're going to break down the door and rape your guests, that's not very hospitable, I admit. We also know, of course, that they're homosexual, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. That's the text, verse 6. To the point of disregarding available females, the daughters. And even when they were blinded, they still persisted. Now, what's interesting is the New Testament has something to say about this passage. It gives us more insight as to what was going on. And we read in 2 Peter that, this is chapter 2, that Lot was oppressed, this is verse 7, Lot was oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, that by what he saw and heard, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day with their lawless deeds. People who indulged the flesh in its corrupt desires and despised authority. Verse 10. Jude says that the crime was that they went, that's verse 7 in the book of Jude, that they went after strange flesh. And some have suggested, oh, well, God was really mad because these men were trying to have sex with angels. But we have no indication that these men thought these men were angels. Everybody thought they were men. And that's why they were trying to have sex. That was the strange flesh, homosexual flesh, not angelic flesh. So, whatever it is that made God so angry that he destroyed these cities was a grave, ongoing, lawless, sensuous activity, according to Peter, that Lot saw and heard, that tormented him as he witnessed it day after day, in which the inhabitants indulged the flesh in corrupt desires by going after strange flesh, ultimately bringing the most extensive judgment upon them anywhere outside of the Bible except for the flood and the book of Revelation. I mean, these guys really got it. This whole city, both of them. So here's my question. What activity fits that biblical description of why God destroys them? Well, it's not inhospitality. For one, are you telling me that God annihilated 2 whole cities because they had bad manners? Oh, manners mattered to the people in the communities, but there's no indication that having bad manners is a capital crime to God. So that seems a little bit much. But here's the other reason why it could not have been inhospitality. Because nothing that happened on that day could have been the reason that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Nothing that happened on that day, no inhospitality, no attempted rape, no having sex with angels, none of that could have been the reason. Because God had already decided to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah when he was talking with Abraham. That was a done deal. The only explanation for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was the rampant homosexuality. Now, Ezekiel does have something to say about it. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. By the way, this is chapter 16, verses 49 and 50. She and her daughters had arrogance and abundant food and careless ease, but they did not help the poor and needy. Well, that was something bad. That bothered God. Ezekiel continues, they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore, I removed them when I saw it. Some people say, wait, it doesn't say anything about homosexuality there. No, but it does say something about abominations. And from the internal evidence of the text that we just looked at, and also what we read in Peter and Jude, it seems like the only credible answer is homosexuality. And what Ezekiel says is that they were guilty of abominations, and that is the very word used of homosexuality in the book of Leviticus. Mark it, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 24 through 26, and also chapter 20. Now, I'm going to skip that passage because I don't have time. I just want to note that the abomination of homosexuality is sandwiched between the prohibition against bestiality and the prohibition against child sacrifice. Maybe this gives you a little idea of what God thinks of that behavior. The wording, by the way, in Leviticus is important. It says, when a man lies with a man as a man lies with a woman. Or you could say as a man is supposed to lie with a woman. The implication there is that there's something about the natural order that God has established that is being violated. And this is one of the reasons it's an abomination. I'm going to let you look at that passage on your own because I want to jump to a New Testament passage in Romans chapter 1, which actually picks up a very similar theme. In Romans chapter 1, I'm starting in verse 18. This is a very well-known passage. Many of you have studied it. It is the beginning of an argument that Paul gives in the book of Romans, which is really the core of the gospel. The book of Romans is the gospel. And Paul begins his argument in chapter 1, verse 18. Then he continues it for like 2 chapters or 2.5 chapters. The first stage there in those chapters of the argument is simply that men are guilty before God. We are lost. The law has shut up everybody under sin. That's the point he's making in those first couple of chapters. He goes on to say what the solution is going to be and how that plays out in their life. And this is a magnificent part of the theme of Romans. But I want you to just see what he says about the problem starting in verse 18. He describes that God is mad about something. He tells us why he's mad. And then he tells us how God responds and what happens to man in that response. I'll read it quickly. For the wrath of God, the orge, the unrestrained anger, we get the word orgy from that, of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That's the problem. They're suppressing it. It's obvious what should be done, but they are doing what they know to be wrong, is Paul's argument. Therefore, and I'm jumping here a little bit, therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, that their bodies might be dishonored among them. For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural, and in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman. Words are very important here. I'm reading out of the New American Standard, which is a very precise translation of this passage. And they burned in their desire toward one another. They abandoned the women, or the function of the woman, burned towards one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. So God gets mad because men are rejecting him. Human beings are suppressing the truth on righteousness. He gives them over then. He just lets them go to do what they want, and this is the kind of immoral behavior and other things, he goes on to explain, that are characteristic of human beings who rebel against God. Now, here are the specific words Paul uses to describe this behavior. He calls this behavior an impurity and dishonoring to the body, verse 24. An indecent act and an error, verse 27. A degrading passion that is unnatural, verse 29. Not proper and the product of a depraved mind, verse 28. Dear friends, there is no way that anybody giving a fair reading to this text can miss what Paul is saying. It is a crystal clear condemnation of homosexuality and a whole bunch of other things, but this is spelled out for us as a very particular example of rebellion against God and his ways, against the way he has made the world. It seems to me there's only one way a person can miss the clarity of the message in Romans 1. And by the way, many people miss it. I'll tell you what they say in just a moment. But the only way they could miss it, it seems to be, is if they're in total rebellion, which is exactly Paul's point of the passage. It's all about human beings suppressing the truth, being in total rebellion so that they are without excuse. Now, there is a rejoinder. That is, there is a response that many people have given nowadays, scholars too, and they've said, wait, you have misunderstood something about this passage. What Paul is teaching against is abandoning one's natural desire. Yes, we should not abandon our natural desire. God gives natural desires, and we should pursue the desires that God gave us. But for homosexuals, their natural desire is for each other, is for same-sex relations. And so you, Mr. Christian, who is suggesting that homosexuals ought to get fixed and go with heterosexuals, you are telling us to violate the very thing that Paul says we shouldn't be violating, and that is our natural desire. Okay, so do you see the counter move here? And unfortunately, some of the translations allow this move because they're not precise. Two quick points. One of them is that there's no evidence that homosexuality is constitutional, that you were born that way. There is no gay gene, or at least they haven't come up with it yet. They've been looking really hard, but they haven't been able to find it. So that's one point. Secondly, Paul was not unclear about what he meant by natural, because he does not say that men abandon their natural desire, leaving the door open for this other interpretation. Rather, and here I want you to focus on verse 26 and 27, and I'm going to read it again, more slowly this time, because listen carefully to the words. For this reason God gave them over to degrading passions, which are their women exchanging the natural function for that which is unnatural, and in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another. The word function is Strong's number 5540 if you want to look it up. It only appears in these two verses in the Bible, but it appears in a lot of places in other Greek literature of the time. And according to Bauer, Arndt, and Gingrich, a Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature, this is the standard reference material for this kind of thing. The Greek word krisis, translated function, means function. Paul is not talking about desires. He is talking about the way God assembled human bodies to function together. He's talking about plumbing. God made woman sexually for man, but the text says that the man abandoned the natural function of the woman and instead burned in their desires towards one another. There's no wiggle room in this passage, friends. Notice the same theme is repeating itself that we saw in the book of Leviticus. That when men lie with men the way they lie with women, what is natural for men and women is not natural for men and women. That's the point of the passage there. That's what makes it an abomination. This is the same theme here. Men with men, women with women, abandoning the function that God himself ordained for human sexuality, perverting it, distorting it, corrupting it, and not only doing these things, it says in the end of the chapter, in addition to a whole bunch of other things listed there, but they also give hearty approval to those who do them. Therefore, Paul says they are without excuse. By the way, what is the outcome when men do not abandon the natural, that is, designed function of the woman? What happens when they use the plumbing the way it was designed to be used? Tell me. Babies. I got two of them. I got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I'm 62. So you pray for me, please. Actually, I got married late. I was just shy of my 48th birthday. My gametes were a little tired by then, so we adopted both of our girls from crisis pregnancies, as it turned out. That's what you get when things work the way they're supposed to work. And I'm going to come back to that point when we talk about same-sex marriage. Now, I'm going to take a break here in just a moment, but I want to introduce this next topic to you before we take a break. I want to talk about same-sex marriage next, actually, for the rest of our time. I hope that what I've done so far is, for you followers of Christ, given you a persuasive argument of what God thinks about homosexuality. There's a lot of other things that are bad in the Bible, too. A lot of things a lot of heterosexuals do as well. So I'm not singling it out as the worst crime. I'm just saying that it's one of the bad ones, all right? I don't want to sell it short. I want you to be properly informed. If you're not a Christian, I want you to be clear on what the Bible says. And if I've made a good case here, well, then you got to deal with that. This is a book that's really informed history for the good for a long time when people actually paid attention to it instead of disobeyed it. So there's some credibility there that you ought to keep in mind. But when it comes to same-sex marriage, this is a policy issue. This is an issue where the government is involved as a representative of our culture, passing laws to promote the common good and the general welfare, to cite a couple of phrases from the Constitution. What is that? The preamble. If the government is involved in this issue for our good, so we need to ask the question whether this is good for us. And that's the question with any policy issue. But we have a challenge in how we address this now in public if we're followers of Christ. On the one hand, because we know what God has just said about these behaviors, we don't want to see something that God calls a moral harm actually encouraged and honored by the laws of the country, because it can't be good for any culture when people are encouraged to do bad. But also, since this isn't a theocracy but a representative republic, Our mere Christian convictions cannot be the basis of policy. We can't just say, well, the Bible says it, that's why it should be in the law. That isn't the way things work in our culture. People are not only is this an inappropriate way to approach it in a pluralistic society, and this is not being a theocracy, but it's inept tactically because people are not persuaded by this by and large, and we have to be able to bring other people on board too. And just throwing Bible verses at them is not going to be adequate for a lot of people. Now, I have a certain conviction, though, about these things, and that conviction is that if God says it's wrong, He's not just being arbitrary. He's not just waking up some morning and say, you know, I'm just going to say, like, homosexuality is wrong for the next 1,000 years. Maybe in 1,000 years I'll change my mind. You know, maybe I'll wake up feeling different about it. No, God has a reason for these things. He says things are right and wrong for our good. Now, if it's true that God gives directives based on really what's good for us and how we are built and what's really good for human flourishing, well, don't you think it would make sense that if we reflected on the thing that God says is bad and the thing that God says is good, we might be able to see some of the reasons why He says that. And maybe we could give our culture the reasons without necessarily the proof texts, and that might be the basis for some conversation. If we identify the particular good that is involved in here, this also could represent an argument that would be acceptable in our larger culture. I mean, God says it's wrong to lie, okay? But, you know, completely apart from what God says, we could say, you know, it's not good when people lie because then you can't trust them and you can't make contracts that you can depend upon and have commerce and see all the things that go wrong when you do this thing that God says not to do. So isn't it just kind of common sense? So I'm going to suggest to you this evening, right after the break, a common sense approach. Yes, they're influenced or informed by my personal convictions about what pleases God, but I'm going to offer a completely secular rationale about what is good for communities of human beings, regardless of their theological convictions. And by the way, the first one doesn't disqualify the second. Just because I have my theological reasons regarding something doesn't mean that I should be disqualified from having a discussion about other things that relate to the common good. And nor should you let people do this. People have done this all the time. Oh, you're doing that because you're a Christian? Shut up, go away, you can't vote. Now, they actually haven't said you can't vote, but that's the implication. You shouldn't be involved in this discussion because that's you're forcing your views on us. Listen, all legislation forces a view. That's the nature of legislation. And in our community, in our culture, in our America, everybody gets a voice. They don't get strained out because their personal values are informed by the Bible. So don't be pushed around on that particular point. But my approach is not religious. It will make no reference to God. It will make no reference to theology or the Bible. And it will make no moral judgment whatsoever on homosexuality. When we return from our break, I'm going to explain to you why we should not treat same-sex relationships the same way that we treat heterosexual unions.